The morning sunlight streamed through the tall classroom windows, casting a warm glow over the rows of wooden desks. Children filled the room with chatter, laughter, and the restless energy that always came at the start of the day. Some were comparing their new pencils. Others were whispering secrets, and a few were already fidgeting, waiting for something fun to happen. The teacher, Miss Collins, clapped her hands gently and asked everyone to settle down. Slowly, the voices faded, and the room grew quieter, though the excitement in the air could still be felt. "Today," Miss Collins announced with a smile, "we're going to do something different. I want each of you to stand up and share something interesting about your family. It could be your mom, your dad, or even your grandparents. Tell us what they do or something special about them." The children's faces lit up. This was not a math problem or a spelling test. It was a chance to talk about themselves, and every child loved that. Hands shot up immediately. Miss Collins nodded at the front row. The first student, a girl with bright pigtails, stood proudly. "My mom is a doctor. She helps people when they are sick." The class clapped politely. Another boy stood up next. "My dad owns a bakery. He makes the best chocolate cake in town." The class giggled, a few children licking their lips, already imagining the taste of the cakes. One by one, the children shared their little family stories. Some said their parents worked at offices, some ran shops, and others spoke of farmers, mechanics, and teachers. Each child stood taller when they spoke, their voices filled with pride as they talked about the people who cared for them at home. Toward the back of the classroom, a boy named Ethan sat quietly, listening to everyone's stories. Ethan wasn't the type who raised his hand too quickly. He was gentle, thoughtful, and often preferred to stay in the background rather than attract too much attention. But today, when the teacher's eyes swept across the room and landed on him, she encouraged, "Ethan, would you like to share something too?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. His fingers played with the corner of his notebook, and his gaze dropped to the floor. The truth about his father was extraordinary, but he knew not everyone believed such things easily. Still, he felt a warm sense of pride in his chest. He thought about his dad's work, the long nights when he would come home late, tired but smiling, with stories about rockets, satellites, and space missions. Ethan admired his father more than words could describe. Taking a small breath, he nodded. Slowly, he stood up. The wooden chair scraped softly against the floor, drawing a few eyes toward him. He straightened his back, though his heart thumped a little faster. For a second, he looked at the rows of curious faces staring at him, waiting to hear his story. Then in a clear and steady voice, he said, "My dad works at NASA." The words seemed to hang in the air. For a split second, the room went quiet. No pencils tapped, no whispers floated. A few children blinked, surprised by what they had just heard. NASA was a word that carried weight. It was the stuff of movies, television, and grand adventures beyond the stars. But to hear it spoken by someone sitting in their ordinary classroom felt almost unbelievable. Then, softly at first, a few chuckles broke the silence. Someone in the front snickered, covering his mouth with his hand. Another whispered to his neighbor, and soon a ripple of giggles moved through the room. To them, it sounded like one of those wild tales kids sometimes made up to sound special. How could Ethan, the quiet boy who rarely spoke up, suddenly claim something so big? Ethan stood still, his face calm, though he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside. He didn't shout or try to defend himself. He didn't need to. Deep down, he knew the truth. His father really did work at NASA. Every night, he had seen the tired eyes of a man who spent his days solving problems that stretched far beyond the Earth. He had seen the notebooks filled with diagrams, the photos of rockets, the badges and official documents. Most of all, he had seen the passion in his father's eyes when he talked about exploring the unknown. The teacher, Miss Collins, raised her eyebrows slightly. She didn't laugh, but there was a hint of doubt in her expression, the kind of doubt adults sometimes carry when faced with something unusual. She smiled gently and asked, "Are you sure, Ethan? That's very interesting." Her tone was polite, but her question only fueled the quiet giggles of the class. Ethan nodded simply. He didn't feel the need to argue. He just sat back down, folding his hands on the desk, letting the others think whatever they wanted. Around him, the whispers continued, children nudging each other, smirking, rolling their eyes. To them, it was just another funny moment in class, something to laugh about during recess. But for Ethan, it was different. He knew what he had said was true, and the pride in his father's work was too great to be shaken by a little laughter. He had learned from his dad that sometimes people laugh when they don't understand. But the truth doesn't need everyone's approval to remain true, and so with a calm heart, Ethan waited quietly, unaware that something extraordinary was about to happen that would turn every chuckle in that room into stunned silence. The room was still buzzing after a string of children proudly shared stories about their families. There had been claps for the girl whose mother was a nurse, smiles for the boy whose father drove a big red fire truck, and even a little cheer for the student who said her uncle played guitar at weddings. The classroom was alive with excitement, the kind that only comes when kids feel like they are the center of attention. In the middle of all this sat Ethan. He had listened carefully to every story, clapping politely for each classmate, though his mind was far away. He thought of his father, the man who always kissed him goodnight no matter how late he came home from work, the man who sometimes smelled of machine oil and coffee, the man who spoke of the universe as if it were just another neighborhood waiting to be explored. Ethan's father didn't just have a job. He was part of something much larger. When Miss Collins's eyes finally landed on him, there was a pause. Ethan wasn't the type to raise his hand first. In fact, he rarely spoke unless called upon. "Ethan," she said kindly, tilting her head, "would you like to share something about your family?" For a moment, the boy hesitated. His stomach tightened. He knew that what he was about to say might sound unbelievable to his classmates. To them, NASA wasn't something real. It was a word they heard in cartoons, movies, or on the news. It was far away in another world, not in the life of a quiet boy sitting in the last row. But Ethan also knew something else. He could not deny the truth about his father. The pride inside him was too strong. Taking a slow breath, he stood. The scraping of his chair against the wooden floor echoed louder than he expected, and suddenly all eyes turned toward him. The whispers died down. Dozens of faces stared, curious to hear what the quiet boy had to say. Ethan looked around nervously. His palms were sweating, but his voice, when it finally came out, was steady. "My dad works at NASA." The words fell into the room like a stone into a still pond, rippling outward. For a second there was silence, pure, unbroken silence. The children blinked. A few tilted their heads as if they weren't sure they had heard correctly. NASA. The very name carried a weight far bigger than their little town, far bigger than their imaginations. And then it happened. A laugh burst from the corner. A boy named Kyle snorted, covering his mouth with his hand. Another child leaned over and whispered something to her friend, and soon the laughter spread like wildfire. Giggles echoed from one desk to another until nearly half the class was chuckling. Some shook their heads, others rolled their eyes. To them it was the funniest thing they had heard all day. NASA, really? One girl muttered under her breath, loud enough for those around her to hear. That's like saying your dad is an astronaut or a superhero. The students around her laughed harder. Ethan felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he didn't sit down. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his eyes fixed on the front of the room. Inside, his heart raced. He could feel every giggle like a pinprick against his skin. Yet in that moment he remembered his father's words. Truth doesn't need defending. It will prove itself when the time is right. Miss Collins, trying to quiet the room, raised her hand. "Class, that's enough," she said firmly. The laughter softened into a low murmur, though a few students still smirked. She turned to Ethan with a small smile, though her raised eyebrows betrayed her doubt. "That's very interesting, Ethan," she said carefully. "Are you sure about that?" The question was simple, but its weight was heavy. Ethan could feel the unspoken doubt in her voice. She didn't believe him either, not fully. He looked at her, nodded once, and replied with quiet certainty, "Yes, I'm sure." There was no hesitation in his tone. No stammering, no nervous laugh to cover his words. Just a boy speaking the truth. He slowly sat back down, the chair creaking as he settled in. Around him, the whispers picked up again. Some kids looked at him like he had just told the wildest lie. Others simply shook their heads. To them, it was just another funny story, a way to make the day more entertaining. But to Ethan, it was something else entirely. He opened his notebook and pressed his pencil against the page, pretending to write while his ears caught every snicker, every muttered comment. But deep inside, beneath the sting of their disbelief, there was a flame of pride. His father wasn't just a story. He was real. His work was real. And Ethan knew, sooner or later, the truth would show itself. And in that quiet confidence, he allowed the laughter to wash over him. He didn't fight back, didn't argue, didn't try to prove anything with words. He just waited. What he didn't know was that the waiting would not be long, and soon something would happen that no one in that classroom would ever forget. The laughter in the classroom didn't stop right away. It rolled through the rows of desks like a wave, starting from a few chuckles and swelling into full-blown giggles. Some children pressed their hands over their mouths to hide the noise, while others leaned on their desks, shaking with amusement. To them, Ethan's claim was not just unbelievable, it was downright hilarious. Kyle, the boy who had snorted first, leaned back in his chair, smirking. "NASA? Come on," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "That's what people on TV talk about, not people like us." His friends nudged each other and burst into another round of laughter. A girl near the window added, "Yeah, maybe next he'll say his dad built a rocket in the backyard." The class roared, their imaginations turning Ethan's truth into a playground joke. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the room. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't playful anymore. It had sharp edges meant to sting. Some kids weren't laughing, but even they glanced at Ethan with doubtful eyes, silently wondering if maybe he had stretched the truth just to feel special. Ethan sat quietly, his back straight, his hands folded neatly on his desk. On the outside, he appeared calm, almost unshaken, but inside his chest, his heart pounded like a drum. Every giggle echoed in his ears. Every mocking glance felt like a spotlight exposing him. He wanted to tell them about the nights his father came home with files full of diagrams and pictures of spacecraft. About the times he'd seen NASA's name printed in bold on the folders his father carried. He wanted to tell them how his dad once explained the way rockets escaped Earth's gravity, his eyes glowing with excitement, but he didn't. He remembered his father's advice again. "People laugh when they don't understand, son. But you don't need to explain everything. Let the truth speak for itself." Those words were like a shield protecting him as the laughter rippled on. Miss Collins clapped her hands once, then twice, louder this time. "All right, that's enough, class," she said sharply, though her voice had to rise above the giggles. Slowly, reluctantly, the children's laughter died down, leaving behind a few smirks and whispers. The teacher gave them a stern look before turning her gaze to Ethan. There was something in her eyes that Ethan noticed, a softness mixed with hesitation. She wasn't mocking him, but she wasn't entirely convinced either. Teachers were supposed to encourage children, to believe in them, but this was different. NASA felt too far away, too big, too unreal to be part of Ethan's quiet little life. "Thank you for sharing, Ethan," Miss Collins said finally, her tone careful, measured. "That's very unique." She moved quickly to call on another student, as if eager to steer the class back to safer ground. As the next child stood up to talk about her dad's car repair shop, the room's focus shifted, but the mocking whispers didn't fully disappear. A few students leaned toward each other, still trading comments about Ethan. "He just wanted attention," one boy muttered. "No way it's true," another girl shook her head. "My dad says people like us don't get jobs like that. NASA is for geniuses and astronauts." Ethan heard every word, though he kept his eyes on his desk, his pencil tracing meaningless lines across his notebook page. He told himself not to care, but the truth was it hurt. It hurt to be laughed at for telling something real. It hurt to see his father's hard work reduced to a punchline. Still, he stayed silent because silence was stronger than arguing. The minutes ticked on. One by one, the children continued sharing their stories, and the classroom returned to its cheerful rhythm. But a strange tension hung in the air around Ethan, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. Every so often, a child would glance back at him, curiosity mingled with disbelief in their eyes. To them, Ethan had become the boy with the wild story, the boy who claimed his dad touched the stars. Yet Ethan didn't bow his head. Deep inside, beneath the sting of their laughter, something else grew stronger, a quiet flame of pride. He could almost hear his father's voice in his mind, steady and certain. "Truth doesn't ask for permission. It just is." What none of them knew, what none of them could even imagine, was how close the truth was to revealing itself. Outside that classroom door, life was going on as usual. The hum of footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of papers in the office, the world moving along in its ordinary rhythm. But within the next few moments, that ordinary rhythm would shatter. The laughter that filled the classroom would vanish, and the very students who mocked Ethan would soon sit in stunned silence, their disbelief crumbling before their eyes. For now, though, Ethan waited. He endured their laughter with the quiet patience of someone who knew that reality, sooner or later, always wins over doubt. And as the last of the giggles faded into the background, the story was already building toward the moment that would change everything, not just for Ethan, but for everyone in that room. The classroom settled down again, but only on the surface. The noise of laughter had faded, yet the unspoken energy still lingered in the air. It hung like a shadow, a quiet tension that pressed against the walls of the room. Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands folded neatly, his eyes fixed on the faint pencil marks on his notebook. He tried not to meet anyone's gaze, but he could still feel them, the curious stares, the skeptical glances, the smirks that hadn't fully disappeared. Miss Collins stood at the front of the room, a faint crease forming on her forehead. She was a kind teacher, patient and warm, the type who always encouraged her students to speak freely. But Ethan's words had struck a different chord. NASA. The letters seemed to echo in her mind. It wasn't the kind of answer she expected from the quiet boy in the back row. It wasn't the kind of answer she expected at all. She cleared her throat and gave the class a quick smile. "All right, thank you, everyone. Let's hear from the next student." But her eyes flicked back to Ethan almost involuntarily. Doubt had crept in, quiet but undeniable. It wasn't that she wanted to embarrass him. No. Miss Collins had always tried to protect her students from ridicule, yet like the others, she struggled to believe. Her mind painted images of the real world she knew, parents who worked in grocery stores, hospitals, construction sites, and offices. NASA belonged to a world far away from their little town, a world of scientists in white coats and astronauts in shiny suits. Could a boy like Ethan sitting in her modest classroom really be connected to that? As the next child spoke about her father's job fixing cars, Miss Collins nodded, smiling and clapping gently. But her thoughts kept circling back. Maybe Ethan had misunderstood what his father did. Children often mixed up big words. A mechanic became an engineer. A helper at the hospital turned into a doctor. Perhaps Ethan's father worked at a factory or an office that sounded a little like NASA, and the boy had simply repeated it with pride. Still, a part of her was unsettled. There had been something in Ethan's tone, a quiet confidence that didn't sound like a lie. Most children, when caught stretching the truth, gave themselves away with nervous laughter or shaky voices. But Ethan's voice had been steady, calm, sure. That was what made her pause. After a few more students shared their stories, Miss Collins finally looked back at him. Her eyes softened, but her doubt was still there. "Ethan," she said, interrupting the flow of the class, "can you tell us more about your father's job? What does he do at NASA?" She emphasized the last word gently, as though testing it, as though it didn't quite fit in her mouth. The class stirred. Whispers buzzed again. Children twisted in their seats, eager to hear what Ethan would say next. Some leaned forward, grinning, expecting another fantasy. Others crossed their arms, skeptical but curious. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. For a moment he hesitated. He thought of his father's work, the late nights at the office, the moments when he explained satellites and rocket launches with patience, sketching diagrams on napkins at the dinner table. He thought of the pride he felt whenever he heard the word NASA spoken on the news, knowing his father was a small but important part of that vast, mysterious world. But Ethan also thought of his father's warning.
"Not everything we do at work can be shared, Ethan. Some things are private."
Some things are too complex for others to understand. His father had explained that sometimes silence was better than over-explaining, that truth carried its own weight without needing to be decorated. So Ethan simply replied, "He helps with rockets and satellites." The room fell quiet again. Miss Collins blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't the detailed answer she had expected, but it didn't sound like the wild exaggeration of a child either. The words were too plain, too simple, too grounded, and yet still too impossible. A boy from the front row snickered. "Yeah, right, rockets, sure." A ripple of giggles followed, though softer this time. The laughter wasn't as confident as before. Something in Ethan's calmness had shaken their certainty. Miss Collins lifted her hand again, silencing the noise. Her voice was firm, though not unkind. "Class, enough." She turned back to Ethan, her expression thoughtful. Inside she was torn. She didn't want to call him a liar. That would crush his spirit. But she also didn't want the other children to leave believing something untrue. Her doubt deepened, but so did her curiosity. Just what if it was true? The clock ticked loudly in the background, marking the slow passing of minutes. The classroom air felt heavier now, the tension thicker. Ethan sat quietly, his face calm, though inside his heart raced faster. He knew they didn't believe him. He could see it in their eyes, hear it in their whispers. But he also knew something they didn't. Truth had a way of showing itself, sometimes in the most unexpected moments. Miss Collins turned her attention back to the lesson, though her mind was restless. She continued calling on students, nodding at their answers, but her thoughts kept circling like a bird that couldn't find a place to land. She kept glancing at Ethan, her doubt slowly shifting into unease. And then, just as the giggles began to fade and the lesson seemed to return to normal, there came a sound. A soft knock on the classroom door. 3 gentle raps that echoed louder than they should have, slicing through the room's uneasy quiet. Every head turned. The teacher froze, and Ethan, sitting in the back row, felt a strange, knowing calm wash over him. The moment was coming. The knock on the classroom door came again, 3 firm but polite taps that echoed louder than the sound itself. It wasn't unusual for visitors to come during lessons, but something about the timing made the air feel different, heavier. The giggles that had lingered a moment ago vanished into silence. Dozens of eyes turned to the front of the room. Even Miss Collins, who rarely showed surprise, paused with her chalk hovering above the blackboard. She walked slowly to the door, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "Now who could that be?" she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Her hand wrapped around the handle, and with a gentle pull, the door swung open. Standing in the hallway was a tall man in a crisp navy suit. His posture was straight, his presence commanding without a single word. His hair was neatly combed, and a badge clipped to his jacket caught the light, its metallic shine unmistakable. In one hand he carried a slim leather folder, in the other a rolled-up document sealed with an official emblem. The classroom seemed to shrink around him as he stepped inside. His shoes tapped against the floor with quiet authority, each step echoing in the silent room. The children's jaws fell open, their earlier amusement dissolving into wide-eyed awe. They didn't know who he was, not yet, but they knew he was someone important. Miss Collins straightened, suddenly aware of the difference between herself, a small-town schoolteacher, and the man who had just entered. She smiled politely, her voice catching slightly. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The man gave a small nod, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on the back row. His voice was deep but calm, steady as stone. "I'm here for my son." Every head swiveled toward Ethan, the quiet boy who had sat through their laughter, who had endured their disbelief with calm patience, now sat very still. His eyes lifted, meeting his father's gaze with a mix of relief and pride. He knew this moment would come eventually, but never had he imagined it would arrive in such perfect timing. The classroom erupted in whispers. "His dad?" someone gasped. "That's his dad?" another murmured. Miss Collins blinked, taken aback. "You're a son?" she asked, glancing from Ethan to the man. "You're Ethan's father?" The man nodded again, stepping closer. As he did, the light caught his badge more clearly. The children leaned forward, squinting until the letters gleamed in unmistakable clarity. NASA. Gasps rippled across the room like wind through tall grass. Some students sat frozen, their eyes wide as saucers. Others exchanged frantic looks, their whispers rising into stunned exclamations. "It's true. It's real." He wasn't lying. Kyle, the boy who had laughed the loudest, sank into his chair, his smirk long gone. The girl who had joked about rockets in the backyard pressed her lips together, her face flushing red. Every mocking word they had spoken now burned back at them like hot coals. Miss Collins herself felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had doubted him too. She had smiled politely, raised her brows, and asked if he was sure. And yet here was the proof, walking, breathing, standing tall in her classroom. She cleared her throat, adjusting her posture as though trying to regain control. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "Welcome, it's a surprise to meet you." The man returned the smile faintly, though his eyes flickered with quiet amusement. He could feel the weight of every stare in the room, the awe, the shock, the disbelief melting into respect. But he wasn't here for the teacher, nor for the other students. He was here for Ethan. He extended a hand toward his son. "Come on, Ethan, time to go." Ethan rose from his chair, his movements calm, steady. But inside, his chest swelled with a pride so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. He walked past his classmates, who watched in stunned silence, their earlier laughter now buried under shame. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say a word. His silence was louder than any victory cheer could have been. As he reached his father's side, the man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. For a moment, the two stood there together, the boy and the man, truth and proof side by side. The classroom, once filled with mocking voices, now sat frozen in reverent silence. Miss Collins, still trying to recover, asked politely, "And sir, you work at NASA?" The man turned his gaze to her, his expression calm but firm. "Yes, I'm Dr. Mitchell. I've been with NASA for over a decade." He didn't need to say more. The weight of those words was enough. The silence that followed was unlike any the classroom had ever known. Not the silence of boredom, not the silence of discipline, but the silence of respect. Every child felt it, an invisible shift in the air, as though the world they thought they knew had just expanded. Ethan glanced once over his shoulder as he left with his father. He saw their faces, the disbelief, the awe, the shame, the respect. For the first time that day, he smiled, not out of pride for himself, but for his dad, the man who truly reached for the stars. And in that moment, the laughter that had stung so sharply only minutes ago no longer mattered. It had been washed away, erased, replaced by something far more powerful. Truth revealed and respect earned. For a few heartbeats, the classroom was utterly still. The kind of stillness that didn't belong in a room full of children. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder, each second marking the weight of the moment. Ethan stood next to his father, his small frame almost dwarfed by the man's tall and confident presence. The students, who only minutes before had laughed at his bold words, now sat frozen, wide-eyed, their whispers caught in their throats. Miss Collins finally found her voice. She cleared her throat and tried to compose herself, though her cheeks betrayed her with a faint blush. "Dr. Mitchell," she began carefully, "it's an honor to have you here. Ethan told us earlier that you work at NASA." She paused, as if giving him one last chance to confirm what now seemed undeniable. The man nodded with quiet certainty. His deep voice carried easily across the silent classroom. "Yes, that's true. I work as an aerospace engineer at NASA. My team helps design and test satellite systems, along with parts of the rockets that launch them into space." Gasps rippled through the room. It was one thing to hear the word NASA. It was another to hear it explained so plainly, so directly, by the man who lived it. Suddenly, all the cartoons, all the news clips, all the images of rockets blasting into the sky weren't just distant fantasies. They were connected to the man standing right there in front of them. Kyle, who had laughed the loudest before, now sank low into his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. The girl who had mocked Ethan about rockets in the backyard pressed her lips tightly together, wishing she could swallow her words. The laughter that had once filled the room now seemed cruel and foolish, a memory they wanted to erase. Dr. Mitchell glanced around, his sharp eyes softening as they landed on the rows of young faces. He wasn't angry. He wasn't here to scold them. But he knew without needing to say it that the truth itself was lesson enough. "I know it sounds unbelievable," he said gently, sensing their awe. "When I was your age, I never imagined I'd be part of something as big as NASA. But sometimes," he added, glancing at Ethan with pride, "the things that sound impossible are the things worth believing in." The classroom shifted again, the silence melting into something deeper, respect. The children sat straighter, their eyes glued to him, no longer with disbelief but with fascination. Their minds raced with questions they didn't dare ask, their imaginations soaring far beyond the walls of the room. Miss Collins, still flustered but curious, asked, "If I may, what exactly do you do at NASA?" Dr. Mitchell gave a small smile, as though he had answered this question many times before but still enjoyed it. "I work with a team of scientists and engineers. We design satellites that orbit Earth. These satellites help with weather forecasts, GPS, communication. You probably use them every day without realizing it. And sometimes we work on projects that go beyond Earth, machines that help us explore space, study planets, and maybe one day take humans even further." The words hung in the air like sparks, igniting something in the children's imaginations. The class wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't doubting. They were dreaming, picturing rockets blasting through the clouds, satellites circling Earth, astronauts stepping onto strange new worlds. Ethan looked around, his chest swelling with pride. He didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for him. The father who kissed him goodnight after long days of work, the man who explained gravity and stars at the dinner table, wasn't just his dad. He was a man shaping the future, touching the edges of space itself. And suddenly, all the laughter from earlier seemed small, petty, even childish. The children who had mocked him now sat in silence, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They realized that Ethan hadn't been boasting or trying to sound special. He had simply spoken the truth. A truth too extraordinary for them to believe until it stood in front of their very eyes. Miss Collins clasped her hands together, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "That's truly remarkable. We're honored you could stop by." Dr. Mitchell nodded politely. "Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt your lesson. I just came to pick up Ethan." But his presence had already done more than interrupt. It had transformed the entire room. Ethan stepped closer to his father, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small smile. Not smug, not proud in a boastful way, but proud in the quiet, steady way of someone whose truth had finally been seen. As he walked toward the door with his father, the children's eyes followed him. Their expressions changed. There was no laughter now, only awe. Even Kyle, the class clown, looked at Ethan differently, as if seeing him for the very first time, and as the door closed gently behind them, the classroom remained quiet for a long time. No one spoke. No one giggled. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of realization. They had learned something that day, not from a textbook, not from a lesson plan, but from the courage of one boy who had dared to tell the truth. The door clicked softly behind Ethan and his father, but the silence they left behind didn't vanish. It stayed heavy and unmoving, as though the very air in the classroom had changed. The same room that had burst with laughter and whispers only minutes earlier was now a place of stillness. The children sat frozen in their seats, their eyes still locked on the door. They seemed to be waiting for the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the proof that the tall man with the NASA badge had really been there. The echo of his voice lingered in their ears. Sometimes the things that sound impossible are the things worth believing in. Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was the loudest laugher, the one who had mocked Ethan the most. Now his usual smirk was gone. His cheeks burned, his hands fiddled with the edge of his desk. He glanced at the other students, hoping to see someone still laughing, someone who thought it had all been a joke. But there were no giggles anymore, not a single smile. The truth had silenced them all. The girl who had teased Ethan about rockets in the backyard sank lower in her chair, her eyes fixed on her hands. She wished she could take her words back, swallow them whole, erase the sound of her own laughter, but it was too late. Ethan's father had walked in, and with him the truth had walked in too. Even the students who hadn't laughed, the ones who had stayed quiet, felt a weight in their chests. They had doubted too. They had looked at Ethan with suspicious eyes, thinking his words were nothing but a fantasy. Now that doubt turned into shame. They realized they hadn't just doubted Ethan. They had doubted the courage it took for him to speak the truth in the first place. Miss Collins stood at the front of the classroom, her hands folded tightly together. For the first time that year, she struggled to find words. She had prided herself on being fair, on encouraging honesty and creativity in her students. Yet she too had let disbelief creep into her tone when she asked Ethan if he was sure. Her face grew warm as she replayed her own words in her mind. She had doubted him just like the others. The classroom was no longer filled with the energy of children eager to speak. Instead, there was only reflection, the kind of quiet where every student's mind was racing, replaying what had just happened. It was as though they had all been given a mirror and were forced to look at themselves, to see how quickly they had turned someone's truth into a joke. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes quietly in silence, in the stillness after a mistake has been realized. And that was what filled the room now. Respect. Respect for Ethan, who had spoken with calm certainty even when everyone laughed. Respect for the man who had walked in with quiet dignity and confirmed the unbelievable. Respect for the truth which had stood tall without needing to shout. Kyle finally lifted his eyes from his desk. For the first time he thought about what it meant to mock someone. He had laughed because it was easy, because it made him feel clever. But now he felt small. He remembered Ethan's steady voice, the way he had stood tall despite the giggles. It took more courage than Kyle had ever shown. Miss Collins cleared her throat gently, trying to break the stillness without shattering it. "Class," she said softly, "I think we all learned something important today." Her voice carried no lecture, no scolding, just a quiet weight. Sometimes the truth doesn't sound believable, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. And sometimes the people we underestimate are carrying the most incredible stories. No one replied, but every child understood. The silence was their answer. Ethan's empty chair at the back of the room seemed different now, no longer just a seat but a reminder of what had happened. His classmates didn't look at it with curiosity or doubt anymore. They looked at it with a newfound respect, as if the boy who usually blended into the background had suddenly become larger than life. For the rest of that day, the classroom carried a different kind of energy. The laughter didn't return, not in the mocking way it had before. When recess came, the children who usually teased or joked too much were quieter. A few of them whispered to each other, but the whispers weren't cruel anymore. They were thoughtful, filled with awe. Kyle walked out to the playground slower than usual. Normally he would be the first to start a game, the first to tease someone, the first to stir up noise. But now he felt humbled. He replayed Ethan's steady words in his head. "My dad works at NASA." And he realized that bravery wasn't about being loud. It was about standing in your truth, even when others laughed. Back inside, Miss Collins sat at her desk during lunch, staring at her gradebook but not really seeing it. Her mind kept returning to Ethan. She had always known he was a bright boy, quiet but observant, the kind of student who paid attention to everything. But today he had shown her something deeper, integrity. She promised herself that the next time a child said something that sounded extraordinary, she would believe first before doubting. The silence of respect lasted not just through that lesson, not just through that day, but long after. The children would carry it with them, tucked away in their hearts. They would remember the time they laughed at Ethan and how wrong they had been. They would remember the way truth walked into the room and silenced them all. And they would remember that respect sometimes comes not in applause or cheers, but in the quiet understanding that someone had been right all along. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the classroom windows, casting golden patterns across the desks. The lesson moved forward, but the earlier moment lingered in everyone's minds like an imprint that couldn't be erased. Even though Ethan and his father had already left, his presence, and the truth that had walked in with him, remained in the air. Children tried to focus on their books, but their thoughts drifted. Each time the name NASA replayed in their heads, it stirred a mix of awe and guilt. They remembered their own laughter, their own disbelief, and how quickly they had judged Ethan. What had once seemed like a wild story had turned out to be the purest truth. That realization weighed heavily on them, reshaping how they saw themselves and, more importantly, how they saw Ethan. Miss Collins wrote on the blackboard, her chalk tapping softly, but her mind wasn't on the lesson either. She kept glancing at the empty desk in the back row. The boy who usually sat so quietly there had spoken only a handful of words, and yet those words had shaken the entire class. She thought of her own doubt, the way she had asked, "Are you sure?" She hadn't meant to hurt him, but she knew that in her hesitation she had joined the laughter. That realization humbled her. Teachers were supposed to believe in their students, but Ethan had taught her a lesson she hadn't expected to learn. Sometimes children carry truths bigger than adults can see. At recess, the playground didn't sound the same as it usually did. There were no loud taunts, no bursts of silly laughter aimed at one student. Instead, small groups of children huddled together, whispering about rockets, satellites, and space. The same kids who had mocked Ethan were now imagining the worlds his father helped explore. Kyle leaned against the fence, staring at the sky. The boy who always had something smart to say found himself quiet for once. He remembered how easily he had laughed, how proud he had felt for making the others laugh too. But now, every time he replayed Ethan's steady voice in his head, "My dad works at NASA," he felt a twist of shame in his stomach. He realized something important. Being the loudest in the room didn't make him right. Sometimes the quietest voice carried the most truth. The girl who had teased about rockets in the backyard sat on the swings, her legs motionless. She thought about Ethan's face when he spoke. He hadn't smiled, hadn't bragged. He had just spoken with calm certainty. She realized her joke hadn't just been a laugh. It had been a dismissal of someone's pride. For the first time, she felt what it meant to make someone feel small, and she didn't like it. Later that week, when Ethan returned to school, the room felt different. As he walked in and quietly took his seat, his classmates looked at him with new eyes. There were no giggles, no whispers this time. Instead, there was a hush of respect. Some smiled shyly at him, others avoided eye contact out of guilt, but none dared to mock. The memory of his father standing in that very classroom was still fresh, still vivid, and it had changed them. Miss Collins greeted him warmly. "Welcome back, Ethan," she said with more care in her voice than usual. He nodded politely, his face calm as always, but deep inside he felt the shift. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with doubt or mockery. It was filled with respect. Over time, the lesson of that day became one of those unspoken stories that stayed with the class. Years later, some of those children would still remember the moment Ethan stood up and told the truth, the laughter that followed, and the silence that came after his father walked in. They would remember it not because of rockets or satellites, but because it taught them something far more important. Never dismiss someone's words just because they sound extraordinary. Truth doesn't always come dressed in what we expect. Sometimes it comes quietly from the boy sitting in the back row. Ethan himself carried the memory differently. He didn't think about the laughter anymore. Instead, he remembered the calm pride he felt when his father appeared. That day became a reminder for him too, that even in the face of doubt, even when people mock what they don't understand, truth will always find its way forward. The greatest lesson that day wasn't written on the blackboard. It wasn't found in a textbook or a worksheet. It was lived, felt, and remembered. The lesson was this: respect everyone's truth, because behind simple words may lie something far greater than imagination. And so, the story that began with laughter ended with silence, not the silence of shame alone, but the silence of understanding, of humility, of respect, a silence that spoke louder than any words.